Baby found a bear cub, hidden in a fishing tackle shop. What he did next caught emotions. The old fishing tackle shop sat on the corner of Maple Street like it had been forgotten by time itself. Jacob Bennett pushed the weathered door open with his shoulder, the familiar bell above chiming its rusty greeting as he stepped inside with his 5-year-old daughter Lily clutching his hand. The place smelled exactly as he remembered from his own childhood visits with his father 20 years ago, a mixture of old wood, leather, and that peculiar earthy scent that seemed to cling to everything related to fishing. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the grimy windows, creating golden pathways through the air that Lily immediately tried to catch with her free hand. Jacob had come here looking for a specific type of fishing reel, something his grandfather had mentioned in an old letter he'd recently discovered while cleaning out the attic. The shop owner, Michael Hayes, was nowhere to be seen at the front counter, which wasn't unusual since the old man often worked in the back room repairing equipment or organizing inventory that probably hadn't moved in years. Lily tugged at Jacob's hand, her eyes wide with wonder at all the colorful lures hanging from the ceiling like a rainbow of metallic fish frozen in mid-swim. Jacob let go of her hand for just a moment to examine a dusty display case filled with vintage reels, telling her to stay close while he looked. But children have a way of finding magic in the most ordinary places, and Lily was no exception. She wandered past the rows of fishing rods standing like silent sentinels, her small fingers trailing along their smooth surfaces as she moved deeper into the shop. The floorboards creaked under her tiny feet, each step taking her further from her father and closer to something that would change everything they thought they knew about the world. In the far corner of the shop, where the light barely reached and shadows gathered like old friends sharing secrets, Lily heard something that made her stop. It was soft, barely audible over the gentle hum of the ancient refrigerator that held live bait, but to a child's sensitive ears, it was clear as day. A whimpering sound, like something small and scared calling out for comfort. Jacob was still absorbed in examining the reels when he realized the shop had gone too quiet. That particular kind of quiet that every parent knows means their child is either up to something or has found something they shouldn't have. He called out Lily's name, his voice echoing slightly in the cluttered space, but received no answer. A flutter of concern passed through his chest as he moved away from the display case, following the path he'd seen her take. The shop was bigger than it looked from the outside, with narrow aisles created by years of accumulated fishing gear, tackle boxes stacked to the ceiling, and shelves that seemed to go on forever. He called her name again, louder this time, and heard her small voice respond from somewhere near the back of the store. Following the sound, he found her in that dim corner, kneeling on the wooden floor next to what looked like a pile of old fishing nets and canvas tarps. But she wasn't alone. At first, Jacob's mind couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Lily was gently stroking something furry, something that moved with each breath, something that looked exactly like a bear cub. His heart jumped into his throat as every parental instinct screamed danger. Bears meant mother bears, and mother bears meant trouble of the worst kind. But something about the scene made him pause before rushing forward. The creature, whatever it was, seemed perfectly calm under Lily's touch. It was small, maybe the size of a cocker spaniel, with fur that was darker than midnight but somehow seemed to catch the light in strange ways. As Jacob's eyes adjusted to the dimness, he noticed more details that didn't quite fit. The creature's breathing was too rhythmic, too musical, like it was humming rather than simply breathing. And when it opened its eyes to look at him, they weren't the dark brown or black of a bear's eyes, but something else entirely. A soft, silvery blue that seemed to hold depths of intelligence no wild animal should possess. Lily looked up at her father with the biggest smile he'd ever seen on her face, completely unaware of any potential danger. She whispered, as if sharing the most important secret in the world, that she'd found a friend who was sad and needed help. The creature made another sound, and this time Jacob heard it clearly. It wasn't quite a whimper or a growl, but something in between. Something that resonated not just in his ears, but somehow in his chest, like the deep notes of a cello played in a cathedral. His rational mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This couldn't be a bear cub. The shape was wrong, the sounds were wrong. Everything about it was just slightly off in a way that made his skin prickle with a mixture of fear and wonder. He took a careful step forward, ready to grab Lily and run if necessary, but the creature just watched him with those impossible eyes, making no aggressive moves. The afternoon light shifted, and for just a moment, a beam of sunlight found its way through a crack in the wall to illuminate the creature fully. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The fur wasn't just dark. It seemed to absorb light in some places and reflect it in others, creating patterns that shifted and moved like oil on water. There were hints of deep purple and blue in the darkness, colors that shouldn't exist in any animal's coat. Lily was still petting it gently, and wherever her hand touched, tiny sparkles of light seemed to follow, like static electricity but gentler, more purposeful. The creature leaned into her touch, and the humming grew slightly louder, more content. Jacob found himself kneeling down beside his daughter, his fear gradually being replaced by an overwhelming curiosity. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't dangerous, at least not in any conventional sense. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements so as not to startle the creature. When his fingers made contact with its fur, he gasped. It didn't feel like animal fur at all. It was soft, yes, but there was something else. A tingling sensation that traveled up his arm and seemed to settle somewhere near his heart. Images flashed through his mind. Not his own memories, but something else. Stars wheeling through an endless night sky, colors that had no names, feelings of loneliness so vast they made his chest ache. He pulled his hand back, shaking, and looked at Lily, who was watching him with knowing eyes far too wise for her 5 years. She said simply that the friend was lost and had been waiting for someone nice to find it. The creature made another sound, this one different, almost like laughter, if laughter could be made of moonlight and whispers. Jacob's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile what he was experiencing with everything he knew about the world. This shop, this ordinary fishing tackle shop where his father had bought his first rod, where Jacob himself had learned to tie his first fly, contained something that shouldn't exist. Yet here it was, as real as the dusty floorboards beneath his knees, as real as his daughter's delighted giggles as the creature nuzzled against her hand. He thought about calling for help, about finding Michael Hayes, about doing something, anything that made sense. But another part of him, a part he'd thought died with childhood, whispered that some mysteries were meant to be experienced, not explained. The creature's eyes met his again, and in them, he saw something that made his decision for him. Trust, simple, pure trust. The kind that exists between old friends who've known each other for lifetimes. Time seemed to slow down in that corner of the shop. The dust motes stopped their dancing. The distant sound of traffic faded away, and all that existed was this moment, this impossible, beautiful moment. Lily was talking to the creature now, not in words exactly, but in the way children talk to their imaginary friends, with absolute certainty that they're being understood, and perhaps she was being understood, because the creature responded to each pause in her chatter with its own sounds, creating a conversation that transcended language. Jacob watched, mesmerized, as the air around them began to shimmer slightly, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but cooler, more inviting. The creature's fur began to glow faintly, not with reflected light but with its own inner luminescence, and Jacob realized with a start that the patterns in its fur weren't random at all. They were moving, swirling, creating pictures and shapes that told stories he couldn't quite grasp but felt in his bones. He was so absorbed in watching this impossible scene that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across them. Jacob looked up, expecting to see another customer, maybe someone who could help him make sense of what was happening. Instead, he saw Michael Hayes, the shop owner, standing there with an expression that wasn't surprise or alarm, but something closer to relief. The old man's weathered face, usually set in the perpetual scowl of someone who'd seen too much of life's disappointments, was soft with something that might have been joy. He moved with surprising grace for someone his age, lowering himself to sit on an overturned bucket near them, his eyes never leaving the creature. When he spoke, his voice was different than the gruff bark Jacob remembered from previous visits. It was gentle, almost reverent, as he said he'd been wondering when someone would finally find her. The pronoun caught Jacob's attention. Her, not it. Her. Michael continued, his words coming slowly as if he was choosing each one with care. He explained that she'd been here for 3 years now, hiding in the back of the shop, waiting. He'd found her one winter night, nearly frozen, collapsed behind the dumpster out back. At first, he'd thought the same thing Jacob had thought. Bear cub, call animal control, stay away from the mother. But when he'd gotten closer, when he'd seen those eyes and felt that presence, he'd known immediately that this was something else entirely. Something that needed protection, needed hiding, needed time to heal from whatever had brought her to this place. He'd brought her inside, made her a bed in this corner where few customers ever ventured, and had been caring for her ever since. She never tried to leave, never caused any trouble, just waited with a patience that seemed infinite. Jacob found his voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper when he asked what she was. Michael's response would have seemed insane if Jacob wasn't currently watching his 5-year-old daughter communicate wordlessly with a glowing creature that shouldn't exist. The old man called her a lumen, though he admitted that was just the name he'd given her because of the way she glowed when she was content. He didn't know what she really was or where she came from. All he knew was that she was intelligent, gentle, and waiting for something or someone. He'd tried to communicate with her over the years, and while she seemed to understand him perfectly, her own communication was limited to those sounds, the lights in her fur, and the feelings she could somehow project into those who touched her. Michael had felt them too, the vast loneliness, the sense of being far from home, the patient hope that someday, somehow, she would find what she was looking for. Lily suddenly laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the dusty corner with joy. The lumen had done something, shown her something in those swirling patterns of light, and whatever it was had delighted the child beyond measure. She turned to her father, her eyes shining with excitement, and announced that the friend wanted to show them something special, something she'd been saving for the right people. Before Jacob could respond, before he could process what that might mean, the lumen stood up. She was bigger than she'd appeared while curled up, maybe 3 feet tall at the shoulder, with a body that was shaped like a bear's, but moved with a fluid grace that no bear possessed. She padded over to a section of wall that looked exactly like every other section, old wooden planks stained with age and neglect. But when she touched it with her nose, the wood began to glow with the same inner light that filled her fur. The wall didn't open or disappear or do anything so dramatic. Instead, it became transparent, like looking through amber or deep water, and beyond it, Jacob could see something that made his rational mind simply give up trying to make sense of things. It was a room, but not a room that could possibly exist in the physical space of the building. It was vast, filled with a soft golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And it wasn't empty. There were others like the lumen, dozens of them, all different sizes and colors, their fur shimmering with that same impossible light. They were looking through the transparent wall with expressions of such hope and joy that Jacob felt tears spring to his eyes without knowing why. Lily clapped her hands in delight, and several of the creatures on the other side seemed to respond, their own lights pulsing in rhythm with her excitement. Michael stood slowly, his old joints protesting, and placed a gentle hand on Jacob's shoulder. His voice was thick with emotion when he explained that he'd seen this only once before, on the night he'd first brought her inside. She'd shown him this vision, this glimpse of wherever she came from, and he'd understood then that she wasn't lost by accident. She was waiting for something specific, for the right moment, the right people. He'd thought maybe it was him, that he was supposed to help her somehow, but as the years passed with no change, he'd realized he was just the guardian, the keeper of this secret, until the real purpose revealed itself. And now, watching Lily interact with the lumen like they'd known each other forever, watching the wall show visions of a place that couldn't exist but clearly did, he understood that this was what she'd been waiting for. The vision in the wall began to change, the room with the other lumens fading away to be replaced by something else. It was Earth, but not quite. It was the world, as seen through different eyes, where every living thing gave off its own light, where connections between people appeared as glowing threads, where love and kindness were visible forces that shaped reality itself. Jacob saw himself and Lily in this vision, saw the bond between them as a golden cord that pulsed with every heartbeat. He saw Michael, surrounded by a softer, older light, tinged with sadness, but also with a deep satisfaction. And he saw the lumen, not as the small lost creature she appeared to be, but as something magnificent, a bridge between worlds. A teacher of sorts, showing them that reality was far more beautiful and complex than they'd ever imagined. The lumen turned to look at Lily, and something passed between them, a communication so pure and direct that it needed no translation. Lily nodded solemnly, as if accepting a great responsibility, then turned to her father with an expression far too serious for a 5-year-old. She explained in her simple, direct way that the friend needed their help. Not to go home, she could do that whenever she wanted, but to help other people see. See what? Jacob wanted to ask, but he already knew the answer. To see the magic that existed in the world, the connections between all living things, the beauty that was always there, but hidden behind the veil of ordinary perception. The lumen had been waiting for someone who could bridge the gap between her world and ours, someone with the innocence to believe, and the words to share that belief with others. She'd been waiting for Lily, but it wasn't just Lily she'd been waiting for. As the vision in the wall faded and the wood became solid again, the lumen approached Jacob. She sat in front of him, those impossible eyes locked on his, and he felt her communication not in words, but in pure emotion. She needed him too, needed his protection, his adult understanding of the world to help navigate what was to come. Because this was just the beginning. Others would come, others like her. As the barriers between worlds grew thin, some would come in peace, like her, seeking understanding and connection. Others might not be so benign. Humanity needed to be prepared, needed to learn to see with different eyes, to expand their understanding of what was possible, And it would start here, in this forgotten corner of an old fishing tackle shop, with a little girl who saw magic everywhere, and a father who was learning to believe again. Michael was speaking again, his voice urgent now. He explained that he'd been preparing for this day without really knowing it. The shop had other secrets, other things he'd collected over the years that didn't quite belong in the normal world. Books written in languages that shouldn't exist, artifacts that hummed with their own inner energy, maps of places that appeared on no satellite image. He'd thought he was just an old man collecting curiosities, but now he understood he'd been gathering tools, resources for whatever was about to unfold. He led them deeper into the shop, past shelves that hadn't been disturbed in decades, to a door that Jacob had never noticed before despite his many visits. It was small, painted the same faded green as the walls, with a lock that looked ancient. But when Michael touched it, it opened smoothly, silently, revealing stairs that led down into darkness. The lumen went first, her natural glow lighting the way. Lily followed without hesitation, her hand in the creature's fur. And Jacob found himself following his daughter into the unknown, with Michael bringing up the rear. The stairs were older than the shop above, carved from stone that felt ancient under Jacob's fingers as he steadied himself against the wall. They descended for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, and emerged into a basement that couldn't possibly exist. It was too big, for one thing, extending far beyond the footprint of the shop above. For another, it was filled with things that made Jacob's head spin. There were other creatures here, preserved somehow in crystalline containers that kept them visible but frozen in time. None were like the lumen. Each was unique, impossible, beautiful in their own alien way. There were books floating in midair, their pages turning of their own accord. There were maps on the walls that showed constellations that didn't match any earthly sky. Michael explained that this had been here when he bought the shop 40 years ago. The previous owner, an old woman who'd claimed to be much older than she looked, had made him promise to keep it secret, to maintain it, to wait for the day when it would be needed. She'd told him stories he hadn't believed, about thin places in the world where other realities touched ours, about guardians who kept watch over these intersections, about a time coming when the walls between worlds would grow gossamer thin and humanity would need to choose between fear and wonder. He'd thought she was crazy, had almost sealed this basement off entirely, but something had made him keep his promise, some instinct or compulsion he couldn't explain. And now, watching Lily and the lumen explore this impossible space like they belonged here, he understood that he'd been part of a plan larger than he could have imagined. The lumen led them to a particular section of the basement, where a pool of water sat perfectly still despite having no visible source. The water was dark, reflecting not the ceiling above but stars, countless stars in configurations that hurt to look at directly. She touched her nose to the surface, and ripples spread out. But instead of disturbing the star reflections, they seemed to bring them into sharper focus. Images began to form in the water, moving pictures that told a story without words. Jacob saw the lumen's world, a place of incredible beauty where thought and emotion had physical form, where beings like her lived in harmony with their environment in ways humanity had forgotten was possible. He saw the moment of her departure, not an exile or accident but a deliberate choice, a mission of sorts. She was an ambassador, one of many sent to different worlds to prepare for a convergence that happened once every few thousand years. The convergence, as the images showed, wasn't an invasion or a merging, but something more subtle. It was a chance for worlds to share knowledge, to learn from each other, to expand the definition of what life could be. But it required preparation, required beings on both sides who could see beyond their own reality's limitations. The Lumen had been searching for such beings, and in Lily's pure acceptance and Jacob's growing wonder, she'd found what she was looking for. The images in the pool showed others like them around the world, children and adults who were having their own encounters with ambassador creatures, each one different, each one perfectly suited to the humans they'd found. It was happening slowly, quietly, in places where wonders still lived, where the impossible could become possible without causing panic. Lily had been quiet during all of this, absorbing everything with the remarkable adaptability of childhood. But now she spoke up, her voice small but determined. She asked if the friend had a name, a real name, not just what Michael called her. The Lumen responded with a sound that was like wind chimes and rainfall and distant thunder all at once, a sound that couldn't possibly be pronounced by human vocal cords. But Lily nodded as if she understood perfectly and announced that she would call her Luna, because she glowed like the moon and came from the stars. The Lumen, Luna, seemed pleased with this, her fur shimmering with waves of silver light. It was such a simple moment, a child naming a pet, but Jacob felt the weight of it. This was how it started, with simple connections, with names and understanding, with the ordinary and extraordinary finding common ground. Michael was pulling books from the floating collection, real books that settled into his hands with weight and substance. He explained that these were journals, records left by previous guardians of places like this. There were instructions, warnings, preparations for what was to come. The convergence would bring wonders, but it would also bring challenges. Not all humans would accept what was happening. Fear would drive some to violence, others to denial. Those who could see, who could accept, would need to be teachers, bridges between the old world and the new. It was a responsibility that Jacob hadn't asked for, but looking at his daughter's face as she played with Luna, he knew he couldn't walk away from it. This was bigger than his small life, bigger than his fears and doubts. This was about the future of not just humanity, but of life itself in all its myriad forms. As they explored the basement further, Luna began to show them things, not through visions this time, but through direct demonstration. She touched a withered plant in a pot that looked like it hadn't seen water in decades, and it burst into bloom. Flowers that gave off their own soft light appearing within seconds. She breathed on a broken clock, and it began to tick, but the hands moved in patterns that had nothing to do with earthly time. She sang, for there was no other word for the harmonious sounds she made, and the very air seemed to thicken with possibility, with potential for change. These weren't party tricks or magic in the traditional sense. Jacob understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that Luna was showing them how her species interacted with reality, how thought and intention could influence the physical world in ways humanity had forgotten or never learned. Lily was trying to copy Luna's demonstrations, and to Jacob's amazement she was having some small success. When she touched the plant Luna had revived, it glowed a little brighter. When she hummed along with Luna's songs, the air shimmered just slightly. Michael explained that children were always more adaptable, their minds not yet fixed in their understanding of what was possible. But adults could learn too, if they were willing to let go of their certainty about how the world worked. He'd been practicing for years, he admitted, and showed them how he could make small objects float for a few seconds, how he could see the emotional residue left on items by their previous owners. These abilities weren't supernatural, he insisted. They were natural capabilities that humans had always possessed but had forgotten how to use, like a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. The afternoon was fading into evening, the light from the shop above growing dimmer, but the basement had its own illumination, provided by Luna and the various artifacts that gave off their own gentle glow. Jacob realized with a start that they'd been down here for hours, but it felt like minutes. Time moved differently in this space. Another impossibility to add to the growing list. He thought about the world above, about his job, his mortgage, his normal life that suddenly seemed like a costume he'd been wearing without realizing it. How could he go back to pretending the world was small and predictable after this? How could he look at anything the same way again? But even as these thoughts troubled him, he felt a strange peace settling over him. This was right. This was what he'd been missing without knowing it. The sense of connection to something larger, something magnificent. Luna approached him again, and this time when she touched him with her nose, he saw not visions but felt knowledge downloading directly into his mind. Not facts and figures, but understanding, deep intuitive understanding of concepts that would have taken years to learn through traditional means. He understood now that consciousness wasn't confined to brains, that it was a fundamental property of the universe itself, expressing itself in countless ways across countless worlds. He understood that the separation between self and other was an illusion, useful for navigation but ultimately false. He understood that love, far from being just a chemical reaction in the brain, was a force as real and powerful as gravity, capable of bridging any distance, any difference. These weren't things he could have articulated or defended in a debate, but he knew them now with the same certainty that he knew his own name. Lily was yawning, the excitement of the day finally catching up with her small body. Luna curled around her protectively, and within moments the child was asleep, her head pillowed on the creature's soft fur. Jacob watched them together, struck by how natural it looked, how right. This was the future, he realized. Not humans alone, not other species alone, but together, learning from each other, growing together into something neither could be alone. Michael was watching too, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He talked about his wife, dead these 20 years, how she would have loved to see this day. She'd always believed in magic, he said, always insisted that there was more to the world than what they could see. He'd loved her for it even while gently mocking her flights of fancy. Now he wished he could tell her she'd been right all along. The old man showed Jacob more of the journals, pointing out passages that seemed particularly relevant. There were protocols for first contact situations, guidelines for helping others accept what they were seeing, warnings about those who would try to exploit the situation for power or profit. There were also beautiful accounts of friendships formed across species barriers, of knowledge shared that had advanced both sides' understanding of existence. One journal, written in handwriting that looked Victorian, described a convergence from 200 years ago, though it had been smaller, more localized. The writer described creatures of living light that had taught humans how to see the electromagnetic spectrum, leading to discoveries that mainstream science attributed to sudden inspiration, but were actually gifts from another world. As Jacob read, he began to understand the pattern. The convergences came in waves, each one larger than the last, each one preparing for the next. Humanity had been being prepared for generations, through stories, through art, through the gradual expansion of scientific understanding that made the impossible seem merely improbable. Every tale of fairies or aliens, every painting of otherworldly landscapes, every scientific discovery that revealed the universe to be stranger than imagined, all of it had been preparation for this moment when the walls would grow thin enough for true communication to begin. Luna and others like her were just the first wave, the ambassadors. More would come, and humanity would need to be ready, not with weapons or fear, but with open minds and willing hearts. The basement began to change as the evening deepened. The walls, which had seemed solid stone, began to show hints of transparency, like the wall upstairs had done. Through them, Jacob could catch glimpses of other spaces, other basements like this one all around the world. He saw a woman in Tokyo teaching a group of children to communicate with a creature that looked like living origami. He saw a man in Cairo carefully tending to what appeared to be a garden of crystalline plants that sang in harmonious frequencies. He saw a teenager in London playing what looked like chess with a being made entirely of shifting geometric patterns. All of them connected. All of them part of the same grand awakening. The isolation that humanity had felt, alone in a vast universe, was ending. They had never been alone. They had just been unable to see their neighbors. Michael produced a leather-bound book, empty of writing, and handed it to Jacob. This would be his journal, the old man explained. Every guardian kept one, recording their experiences, their learnings, their mistakes and triumphs. Someday, someone else would read it, would learn from it, would add their own chapter to the ever-growing story of convergence. Jacob accepted the book with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of it was more than physical. It was the weight of responsibility, of being chosen for something he didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. He thought about his ordinary life, his ordinary job, and realized with a mixture of sadness and relief that ordinary was no longer an option. He'd been changed by this experience, marked by it in ways that would make returning to ignorance impossible. Luna stirred, gently waking Lily with a soft humming sound. The child opened her eyes, blinking in the soft light, and smiled as if waking from the most wonderful dream only to find it was real. She asked if they could come back tomorrow, if Luna would still be here, if they could learn more about the star places she'd seen in her dreams. Jacob looked at Michael, who nodded with a gentle smile. The shop would always be open to them now, the old man said. This was their place too, their responsibility and their gift. But more than that, Luna would be coming with them, at least part of the time. She needed to be out in the world, needed to form connections with more people, needed to begin the slow process of helping humanity see with new eyes. The shop would be her safe haven, but Lily's home would be her bridge to the human world. The thought of explaining this to anyone else, of trying to make others understand what had happened here, seemed impossible. But Luna touched his mind again, and he understood that he wouldn't be alone in this. There were others, a growing network of people who had had their own encounters, their own awakenings. They would find each other, would support each other, would work together to prepare the world for what was coming. It wouldn't be easy. There would be those who would refuse to believe, who would react with fear or anger. There would be challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But there would also be wonders beyond description. Friendships that transcended species, knowledge that would transform humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. As they prepared to leave the basement, to return to the world above that would never look quite the same again, Luna did something unexpected. She touched the pool of star-reflecting water again, but this time, instead of showing visions, she pulled something out of it. It was small, no bigger than a marble, but it glowed with the same inner light that filled her fur. She gave it to Lily, who held it carefully in her small hands, eyes wide with wonder. Michael explained that it was a seed of sorts, though not for any plant that grew in soil. It was a seed of possibility, of potential. When the time was right, when enough people were ready to see and believe, it would grow into something that would help bridge the worlds permanently. But that time was not yet. For now, it was enough that it existed, that it was in the hands of a child who believed in magic, and a father who was learning to. They climbed the stairs slowly, each step taking them back toward the familiar world, but carrying with them the knowledge of what lay beneath, what lay beyond. The shop looked different now to Jacob's eyes. He could see the thin places, the spots where reality was more flexible, where Luna's world pressed close against their own. He could see the threads of connection between all the objects, the stories they held, the purposes they might serve in the days to come. And he could see Michael differently too, not just as a gruff old shop owner, but as a guardian, a keeper of secrets, a bridge between worlds who had been waiting patiently for this day to come. Luna followed them through the shop, her presence both impossible and undeniable. When they reached the door, Jacob hesitated. Outside was the normal world, the world of traffic and bills and rational explanations. How could they take something as extraordinary as Luna into that mundane reality? But Lily had no such hesitations. She pushed open the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk, Luna beside her. And something remarkable happened. The few people passing by glanced at them and smiled, seeing what they expected to see: a man, a child, and what was probably a large dog of unusual coloring. Their minds, unable to process what Luna really was, simply edited her into something acceptable, something that fit their understanding of the world. It was a kind of magic in itself, Jacob realized, the magic of perception, of seeing only what one was ready to see. The walk home was surreal. Luna padded along beside them, occasionally stopping to investigate something with those impossible eyes. And each time she did, the thing she examined seemed to shine a little brighter, seem a little more alive. A withered tree in someone's yard sprouted a few new leaves. A stray cat, mangy and suspicious, approached Luna, and after a moment of communion, walked away with its coat somehow glossier, its eyes brighter. Even the sidewalk itself seemed to respond to her presence, the cracks filling with tiny flowers that hadn't been there moments before. And yet no one noticed, or if they did, they dismissed it as trick of the light, as something that had always been there that they'd just never observed before. When they reached their small house on the quiet street where they'd lived since Lily was born, Jacob paused at the threshold. Once Luna entered their home, their lives would be forever changed. There would be no going back to the way things were. But looking at his daughter's face, radiant with joy and possibility, he knew that going back had never really been an option. From the moment Lily had heard that whimpering in the corner of the shop, their fate had been sealed. They were part of something larger now, something beautiful and terrifying and absolutely necessary. He opened the door, and Luna entered their home like she'd always belonged there, immediately finding a spot by the window where the last rays of sunlight could catch her fur, making it shimmer with all those impossible colors. That night, as Jacob tucked Lily into bed with Luna curled at her feet, his daughter asked him if everything would be different now. He wanted to lie, to tell her that things would stay the same, that this was just a special secret they would keep. But Luna's presence had taught him something about truth, about the importance of honesty in the face of change. So he told her yes, everything would be different, but different didn't mean bad. Different meant new adventures, new friends, new ways of seeing the world. Different meant that the universe was bigger and more wonderful than they'd ever imagined. Lily seemed satisfied with this answer. Closing her eyes with a smile, her hand resting on Luna's fur, already dreaming of star pools and crystal gardens and friends made of light. Jacob sat in his living room afterward, the journal Michael had given him open on his lap, trying to find words for what had happened. How did one describe the indescribable? How did one explain that reality was far more flexible than anyone imagined? That consciousness wasn't limited to human brains? that love and connection were forces that could bridge any gap between worlds. He wrote slowly, carefully, knowing that someday someone would read these words and need them to make sense of their own impossible experience. He wrote about Lily's fearlessness, about Luna's patient waiting, about Michael's quiet guardianship. He wrote about the basement that couldn't exist, about the visions in the water, about the seed of possibility now sitting on Lily's nightstand, glowing softly in the darkness. As he wrote, Luna padded into the room and settled beside his chair. She didn't make any sound, didn't project any visions or feelings, just sat there, a comforting presence that reminded him he wasn't alone in this. The house felt different with her in it, more alive somehow, as if her presence had awakened something that had always been there but dormant. He could sense the connections now, between the house and the earth it sat on, between his family and all the families that had lived here before, between this moment and all the moments that had led to it. It was overwhelming and comforting at the same time, like finally understanding a song that had been playing in the background his whole life. The night deepened, and Jacob continued to write, documenting everything he could remember, everything he'd learned. Outside, the world went on as it always had, unaware that in this small house, on this quiet street, a bridge between worlds had been established. But Jacob knew this was happening elsewhere too, in countless homes and shops and forgotten corners around the globe. Humanity was waking up, slowly, gently, to the reality that they were not alone, had never been alone. The convergence Michael had spoken of wasn't a single event but a process, a gradual opening of eyes and minds and hearts to possibilities that had always existed but had been invisible to those who couldn't or wouldn't see. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled, but it didn't sound quite like any dog Jacob had ever heard. Luna's ears perked up, and she made a soft sound in response, a sound that carried farther than it should have, that would be heard by ears that weren't quite human, weren't quite of this world. It was a signal, Jacob understood, a message that another connection had been made, another bridge established. The network was growing, strengthening, preparing for whatever came next. He thought about the world his daughter would grow up in, a world where the impossible was possible, where friendship could transcend species, where the universe was alive with consciousness and forms humanity was only beginning to imagine. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. But for Jacob, it felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another, a life where magic was real, where his daughter could speak without words to a being from another world, where an old fishing tackle shop could contain doorways to impossible places. He closed the journal, his hand cramping from writing, but his mind still racing with everything that had happened, everything that was yet to come. Tomorrow they would return to the shop. Tomorrow Lily would learn more from Luna, and Luna would learn more from Lily. Tomorrow the quiet revolution would continue, one connection at a time, one awakened mind at a time. But tonight Jacob simply sat in his transformed living room, watching Luna breathe, her fur cycling through those impossible colors with each inhale and exhale. He thought about fear and wonder, about how close they were to each other, how easily one could become the other. He'd felt both today, terror at the unknown and awe at the beautiful, and somehow they'd combined into something new, something that felt like growth, like evolution. This was how humanity would move forward, not through force or technology alone, but through the willingness to see beyond their limitations, to accept that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than they'd ever dared to believe. A soft sound from upstairs caught his attention. Lily was talking in her sleep, but the words weren't in English or any language Jacob recognized. Luna's ears perked up, and she made a pleased sound, as if responding to whatever Lily had said. They were learning from each other even in dreams, Jacob realized, building a bridge between worlds with every interaction. He wondered what Lily would be like in a year, in 5 years, in 10. Would she still be his little girl, or would she become something new, something that was both human and more than human? The thought should have frightened him, but instead, it filled him with a fierce pride. His daughter would be part of the generation that brought humanity into a larger community of consciousness that helped their species take its next evolutionary step. The night was quiet except for the usual suburban sounds, distant cars, the hum of air conditioners, the occasional bark of a normal dog. But underneath those familiar noises, Jacob could now hear something else, a subtle harmony that had always been there, but that he'd never noticed before. It was the sound of life itself, of consciousness in all its myriad forms, singing together in frequencies that most humans couldn't perceive. Luna was teaching him to hear it, not with his ears but with some other sense that had no name yet. It was beautiful and complex, like a symphony where every living thing played its part, where even silence was a kind of music. 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. Part 2, The Keeper of Starlight. The next morning arrived with a quality of light that seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if Luna's presence had clarified the very air in their home. Jacob woke to find Lily already up, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with Luna, both of them surrounded by toys and books that were behaving in ways that toys and books definitely shouldn't behave. The stuffed animals were moving on their own, not dramatically, just small shifts and gestures as if they were listening to a story. The books were floating a few inches off the ground, their pages turning by themselves, showing pictures that seemed to move and change, even though Jacob knew they were just printed ink on paper. Lily looked up at him with eyes that sparkled with delight and announced that Luna was teaching her how to wake things up, how to show them they were more alive than they knew. Any rational parent would have been terrified, would have grabbed their child and run from this impossible scene. But Jacob had moved beyond rational sometime yesterday in that basement that couldn't exist. Instead, he sat down beside them, watching as his daughter learned to manipulate reality in ways that physics said were impossible. Luna was patient, showing Lily through example rather than instruction how intention and emotion could influence the physical world. It wasn't telekinesis exactly, more like convincing objects that they wanted to move, that movement was their natural state. The stuffed rabbit that had been Lily's favorite since she was 2 hopped across the floor, not because Lily was controlling it, but because she'd somehow awakened a kind of consciousness within it, a simple awareness that responded to her love for it. Jacob thought about calling in sick to work, but then realized with a start that it was Saturday. The days had blurred together in the intensity of recent events. He made breakfast while Lily and Luna continued their strange lessons, and even that simple act felt different. The eggs seemed fresher, the toast more golden, the orange juice more vibrant. Was Luna's presence affecting everything in the house, or was he just seeing things more clearly now? When he brought the food to Lily, Luna sniffed at it curiously, then did something that made the meal glow faintly for a moment. When Lily took a bite, her eyes widened. She said it tasted like sunshine, like the feeling of laughing, like Saturday mornings were supposed to taste. Jacob tried it himself and understood immediately. The food hadn't changed chemically, but something about it had been enhanced, made more essentially itself. They returned to the shop after breakfast, finding Michael already there, looking like he hadn't slept, but somehow more energized than Jacob had ever seen him. The old man explained that more people had come during the night, drawn by dreams or instincts they couldn't explain. They were downstairs now, learning, preparing. He led them down those impossible stairs again, and the basement was transformed. Where yesterday it had been a museum of mysteries, today it was alive with activity. There were maybe a dozen people there, all ages, all walks of life, each accompanied by a creature that shouldn't exist. There was a businessman in a rumpled suit sitting with what looked like a miniature dragon made of living glass. There was a teenage girl whose companion appeared to be a cloud of sentient colors that responded to her emotions. There was an elderly woman knitting while a creature that seemed to be made entirely of folded space curled at her feet. None of them seemed surprised to see Luna or to meet Jacob and Lily. There was an immediate sense of kinship, of shared experience that needed no explanation. They had all been chosen, or had chosen, or perhaps choice had nothing to do with it. They were all part of something now, something that was bigger than any individual but that needed each individual to function. The businessman, who introduced himself as Connor Adams, explained that he'd been having dreams for weeks, dreams of crystal cities and singing mathematics. Then, yesterday, on his way home from another soul-crushing day at the office, he'd felt compelled to turn down an alley he'd never noticed before and found his companion waiting for him, patient as if they'd had an appointment scheduled for years. The teenage girl, Savannah Reed, had a different story. She'd always been able to see things others couldn't, had spent years in therapy being told her visions were hallucinations, symptoms of a disorder that needed to be medicated away. But the medications had never worked because what she was seeing was real, just invisible to those who couldn't perceive beyond the normal spectrum. Her companion had found her last night, drawn by her natural ability, and for the first time in her life, she felt validated, understood, sane. Her parents thought she was at a friend's house. She would have to go home eventually, would have to explain somehow, but for now she was just reveling and not being alone, not being crazy, not being wrong about the nature of reality. The elderly woman, who asked to be called simply Mrs. Chen, had the most remarkable story of all. She'd been part of a previous convergence, a smaller one, 50 years ago in Hong Kong. She'd been young then, had thought it was a dream or a breakdown, had spent decades convincing herself it hadn't been real. But she'd kept the gift her companion had given her before disappearing, the ability to fold space in small ways, to step from one place to another if the distance was short enough and her need was great enough. She'd used it sparingly over the years, afraid of what it meant, afraid of being discovered. But when she'd felt the call yesterday, when she'd known the convergence was beginning again, she'd stepped through space from her apartment in Chicago to this basement in an instant, drawn by a certainty she couldn't explain. Each person had brought their own piece of the puzzle. Connor's companion could crystallize thoughts into physical form, creating structures of pure idea that could be touched and examined. Savannah's could show the emotional connections between people as visible streams of color, revealing the hidden web of relationships that connected all humanity. Mrs. Chen's could fold not just space but time in small ways, showing glimpses of possible futures, potential pasts. Together, they were learning that these abilities weren't separate gifts, but aspects of a single greater capability that humanity was evolving toward. The ability to perceive and interact with reality as it truly was, not as their limited senses had shown them. Michael had been busy through the night, organizing what he called a curriculum, though it was unlike any educational program Jacob had ever seen. There were no textbooks or lectures, just experiences, shared moments of discovery where human and companion worked together to unlock new ways of seeing, new ways of being. Luna took a central role in this, her patient presence somehow making it easier for the humans to accept what they were experiencing. She would touch each person gently, and in that touch they would feel the fear leaving them, replaced by wonder and acceptance. Even the most skeptical among them, a physicist named Dr. Sarah Martinez, who kept muttering about violations of conservation laws, eventually surrendered to the reality of what was happening. Lily, despite being the youngest present, seemed to understand things instinctively that the adults struggled with. She moved between the different groups, translating concepts that the companions were trying to convey, bridging gaps in understanding with the unique clarity of childhood. When Connor's dragon created a crystal that contained the concept of homesickness, Lily was the one who showed everyone how to touch it and experience the feeling without being overwhelmed by it. When Savannah's colors revealed a connection between two people who'd never met before, Lily explained that they were family, not by blood, but by choice, connected through decisions they hadn't made yet but would. The day progressed in a strange, dreamlike fashion. Time seemed to move differently in the basement, sometimes racing forward, sometimes slowing to a crawl. Jacob found himself learning things he couldn't quite put into words, understanding concepts that his mind couldn't fully grasp but that his heart accepted completely. He learned that consciousness wasn't produced by the brain but was channeled through it, like water through a faucet. He learned that every choice created ripples that affected not just the future but the past as well. That linear time was an illusion created by limited perception. He learned that love wasn't just an emotion, but a fundamental force that held reality together, as essential as the strong nuclear force that held atoms together. Luna began showing them something new as the afternoon wore on. She led them to a section of the basement that hadn't been there yesterday. A circular room with walls that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight. In the center was a pool similar to the one they'd seen before, but this one was active, swirling with images and sounds from around the world. They could see other groups like theirs, other basements and hidden rooms where humans and companions were gathering, learning, preparing, but they could also see the resistance, the fear, the violence that was beginning to emerge as more people became aware that something was changing. In London, a companion had been captured by a government agency, was being studied in ways that made Jacob's stomach turn. In Tokyo, a mob had formed outside a building where a convergence gathering was taking place. Their fear turned to anger by leaders who saw the change as a threat to their power. In New York, a child like Lily, one who could see and communicate with the companions naturally, had been taken from her parents by authorities who claimed she was dangerous, infected with something alien. The images were hard to watch, but Michael insisted they needed to see them, needed to understand what they were up against. Not everyone would welcome the convergence. Many would fight it with everything they had. But for every scene of fear and violence, there were a dozen of wonder and connection. They saw a hospital in Mumbai where a companion was helping doctors understand illness in a completely new way, leading to cures for conditions that had been considered hopeless. They saw a school in Sao Paulo where children were learning alongside companions, their education transformed into something that engaged not just their minds, but their spirits. They saw a farm in Kenya where the partnership between human and companion had resulted in crops that grew in impossible abundance, feeding villages that had known only hunger. The convergence wasn't just about expanding consciousness. It was about solving the problems that had plagued humanity for millennia. Mrs. Chen shared more of her experiences from the previous convergence, warning them that what they were experiencing now was just the beginning. The real challenge would come when the wider world could no longer ignore what was happening. When the existence of the companions and the abilities they awakened could no longer be dismissed as hoax or hallucination. There would be those who would try to weaponize the companions, to use them for power and control. There would be those who would see them as demons or invaders, who would call for their destruction in the name of protecting humanity. And there would be those who would simply break under the weight of a reality that was so much larger and stranger than they'd ever imagined. But there was hope too, she insisted. The previous convergence had been smaller, localized, easier to suppress and forget. This one was global, synchronized, impossible to completely hide or deny, and humanity itself had changed in the 50 years since she'd had her first experience. The internet had connected people in ways that hadn't been possible before, had created a global consciousness of sorts that was more prepared for this kind of change. Science fiction had prepared the imagination. Quantum physics had prepared the intellect, and the global challenges of climate change and inequality had prepared the spirit for the need for transformation. Humanity was as ready as it would ever be for this evolutionary leap. As evening approached, the gathering began to disperse. People had lives to return to, families to explain things to, decisions to make about how to integrate what they'd learned into their daily existence. Connor spoke about going back to his office on Monday, about how impossible it would be to care about quarterly reports and profit margins after experiencing the crystallization of pure thought. Savannah worried about her parents, about how to explain that what they'd always feared about her was true, but that it was wonderful, not terrible. Dr. Martinez was already making plans to document everything, to find ways to measure and quantify what was happening that might make it acceptable to the scientific community. Jacob and Lily prepared to leave too, but Luna did something unexpected. She went to each person in turn, touching them gently, and left a small mark on their skin, not a wound or a burn, but a tiny patch that glowed with her characteristic light, visible only to those who could see beyond the normal spectrum. It was a sign, Michael explained, a way for them to recognize each other in the outside world, a mark that showed they were part of the convergence. It would fade in time, but by then, they wouldn't need it anymore. By then, the ability to see beyond the veil would be permanent, integrated into their being in a way that couldn't be removed or suppressed. The walk home was quieter than the day before. Lily was tired from the intensity of the day's experiences, and Luna seemed subdued, perhaps sensing the challenges that lay ahead. Jacob's mind was racing with everything he'd learned, everything he'd seen, everything that was yet to come. He thought about his job at the accounting firm, about the mundane life he'd been living just 2 days ago. How could he go back to that? How could he pretend to care about numbers on a spreadsheet when he'd seen thoughts turned into crystal? When he'd watched his daughter wake toys to life? When he'd felt the pulse of a living universe that was so much more than humanity had ever imagined? But as they entered their home, as Lily sleepily hugged Luna goodnight and stumbled off to bed, Jacob realized that going back wasn't the point. The convergence wasn't about abandoning normal life, but about transforming it, about bringing the magic into the mundane, about showing that the ordinary world had always been extraordinary. People just hadn't been able to see it. He would go to work on Monday, but he would go with new eyes, able to see the connections between his co-workers, the energy patterns in the numbers he worked with, the potential for transformation in even the most boring corporate environment. The convergence wasn't happening in some separate, special realm. It was happening here in the regular world, transforming it from within. That night, Jacob dreamed, but they weren't his dreams. They were shared dreams, connected to everyone who bore Luna's mark, to everyone who was part of the convergence. In the dreams, he saw the world as the companions saw it, not solid and separate, but fluid and connected. A vast web of consciousness expressing itself in countless forms. He saw the future, not as a fixed destination, but as a garden of possibilities, each choice planting seeds that would bloom in ways no one could fully predict. He saw Lily grown up, standing at the intersection of two worlds, helping humanity take its next evolutionary step, not through force or technology, but through understanding and connection. He woke several times during the night, each time finding Luna sitting by his bedside, watching over him with those impossible eyes. She wasn't just protecting him, he understood, but maintaining the connection, keeping the dream network stable while the humans learned to navigate it. This was exhausting for her, he could tell, this constant bridging of worlds, this patient teaching of a species that had forgotten how to see. But she never complained, never showed anything but gentle determination. She had waited 3 years in that shop for this moment, and she would see it through no matter what it cost her. In the morning, Lily woke with a new ability. She could see the dream network while awake, could touch the shared consciousness that connected all those who were part of the convergence. She described it like a river of light flowing just beneath the surface of regular reality, carrying thoughts and feelings and knowledge between all who had been marked. Through it, she could feel Connor struggling with whether to quit his job, could sense Savannah trying to explain things to her bewildered parents, could perceive Mrs. Chen teaching a small group of children in Chicago how to fold paper in ways that folded space itself. They were all connected now, all part of something larger, and that connection would only grow stronger as more people joined the convergence. Michael called them on a phone that shouldn't have been able to receive calls in the basement where he was, another small impossibility to add to the growing list. He had news, both good and bad. The good news was that convergence points were opening all over the world, places where the veil between worlds was especially thin, where companions could cross over more easily. The bad news was that not all the companions were as benign as Luna and the others they'd met. Some came from worlds with different values, different understandings of life and consciousness. Not evil exactly, but alien in ways that could be dangerous if not properly understood and managed. There had been incidents, misunderstandings that had led to injuries, even deaths. The convergence was not without its risks, but the network was responding, organizing, learning. Those who had been marked were finding each other, sharing knowledge, developing protocols for first contact situations. Scientists like Dr. Martinez were creating frameworks for understanding the new physics that the companions represented. Artists were painting and writing and composing works that helped others see beyond the veil. Teachers like Mrs. Chen were developing curricula for children who would grow up in a world where the impossible was possible. And people like Jacob and Lily, ordinary people who had stumbled into extraordinariness, were serving as bridges, showing others that the convergence wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace. Days passed in a blur of discovery and challenge. Jacob did return to work, but as he'd expected, it was different now. He could see the energy patterns in the spreadsheets, could feel the connections between numbers that revealed hidden patterns of waste and potential. His productivity skyrocketed, but more importantly, he began to see ways the company could transform, could become something more than a profit-generating machine. His co-workers noticed the change in him, some attracted to his new confidence and clarity, others disturbed by it. He was careful not to reveal too much too quickly, but he planted seeds, small suggestions that would grow into larger changes over time. Lily's integration was both easier and harder. Children at her school were naturally more open to the impossible, but their parents were another matter. When Lily's teacher called to report that Lily had been telling other children about her imaginary friend, who was teaching her to make toys come alive, Jacob had to carefully navigate the conversation, neither confirming nor denying, keeping Luna's existence secret while not making Lily feel like she'd done something wrong. It was a delicate balance that millions of parents around the world were learning to maintain as their children developed abilities that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding. Luna herself was changing too. The more time she spent in the human world, the more human-like she became in some ways. She was learning to modulate her appearance, to seem more like an unusual dog to those who weren't ready to see her true nature. She was learning human humor, often making Lily giggle with perfectly timed gestures or expressions. But she was also growing tired, the strain of maintaining the bridge between worlds taking its toll. Michael explained that this was expected, that the first wave of companions would eventually need to return to their own world to recover, but that by then the bridge would be strong enough to maintain itself, held open by the growing network of awakened humans. One evening, about 2 weeks after their first encounter, Luna showed them something new. She led them to the backyard, where the stars were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. She sat in the center of the lawn and began to sing. Not with sound, but with light, her fur creating patterns that rose into the air like luminous smoke. The patterns formed shapes, pictures, stories that hung in the air for moments before dissolving into sparkles that drifted away on the breeze. She was calling others, Jacob realized, sending a signal to companions who were still waiting, still deciding whether humanity was ready for contact. The response came within minutes. Lights appeared in the sky, not UFOs or anything so dramatic, but subtle glows that might have been dismissed as unusual cloud formations or atmospheric phenomena by those who didn't know better. But Jacob and Lily knew better. They watched as the lights descended, resolving into forms as they got closer. More companions, each unique, each beautiful in its own alien way. There was one that looked like a living aurora borealis, constantly shifting between colors that didn't have names. There was another that seemed to be made of living wood, its body a twist of branches and leaves that moved with impossible grace. There was a third that defied description entirely, a shape that hurt to look at directly, because it existed in more dimensions than human eyes could process. They didn't stay long, these new arrivals. They touched Luna briefly, exchanging information in ways that bypassed language entirely, then dispersed into the night, heading for their own destined encounters with humans who were ready to see them. But their visit had served its purpose. The convergence was accelerating. More companions were coming, and with them, more opportunities for humanity to evolve, to grow, to become something more than it had been. But also more challenges, more chances for misunderstanding, more potential for fear and conflict. That night, Lily asked a question that had been bothering her. What happened to the people who couldn't see, who couldn't accept what was happening? Would they be left behind? Luna's response, filtered through the emotional communication she shared with the child, was complex but ultimately hopeful. No one would be left behind, not really. The change would come to everyone eventually, at their own pace, in their own way. Some would lead, some would follow. Some would resist until the very end. But ultimately, the convergence was not about dividing humanity, but about reuniting it with a larger community of consciousness it had always been part of, but had forgotten. The seed that Luna had given Lily on that first night had begun to glow more brightly, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the global heartbeat of the convergence. Michael had explained that when enough people were ready, when the network was strong enough, the seed would bloom into something that would make the convergence permanent, irreversible. It would create what he called a resonance anchor, a point of connection between worlds that couldn't be severed. But that time was still months, maybe years away. For now, it was enough that it existed, that it grew stronger with each new connection, each awakened mind, each heart that opened to the impossible. Jacob had started writing more in his journal, documenting not just the extraordinary events but the ordinary moments too. Lily doing homework with Luna's head in her lap, both of them surrounded by a faint glow that made the math problems somehow easier to understand. The way his morning coffee tasted different now, richer, more complex, as if his enhanced perception could detect notes and flavors that had always been there but hidden. The dreams he shared with the network, where problems were solved collectively, where knowledge was exchanged freely, where the boundaries between self and other became beautifully blurred. He wrote about the resistance, too, the growing movement of those who saw the convergence as a threat. There were protests now, demands for government action, calls to capture and study the companions. There were religious leaders declaring it the end times, scientists insisting it was all mass hallucination, politicians trying to use the fear and confusion for their own gain. But for every voice raised in fear, there were 10 raised in wonder. Children especially were embracing the change, their natural openness making them perfect ambassadors between worlds. In schools around the world, despite official attempts to suppress it, kids were teaching each other the new ways of seeing, the new ways of being. Mrs. Chen visited them one evening, not through the door, but by stepping through folded space directly into their living room. She'd come to warn them that something was coming, something the network had sensed but couldn't quite identify. Not a threat exactly, but a test, a moment when humanity would have to choose its path forward. The companions were preparing for it, strengthening their connections with their human partners, teaching more intensively, more urgently. She couldn't say exactly what form this test would take, but she emphasized the importance of the children, especially children like Lily, who could bridge the worlds naturally. They would be crucial in whatever was to come. That night, the dreams were different, more intense, more unified. Everyone in the network experienced the same vision, a great gathering, representatives from not just Earth and the companions' worlds, but from hundreds of civilizations, all converging at a point that existed outside normal space and time. It was a council of sorts, a moment when the future of Earth's participation in the larger community of consciousness would be decided. Not by force or vote, but by demonstration, by showing whether humanity had grown enough to join as equals rather than subjects or observers. The test Mrs. Chen had mentioned wasn't something imposed from outside, but something humanity would create for itself, a moment of choice that would define the species' future for generations to come. When Jacob woke, he found Luna standing at the window, looking out at the stars with an expression he'd never seen on her before. It might have been longing or sadness, or perhaps a mixture of both. He understood, without being told, that she missed her home, her own kind, the world she'd left behind to serve as a bridge. But when Lily woke and wrapped her arms around Luna's neck, the creature's expression changed to one of pure contentment. This was her purpose, her choice, her gift to both worlds. The sacrifice was worth it for moments like this, for the possibility of what humanity could become. The next few days brought a series of small miracles that began to shift public perception. A child in India who'd bonded with a companion successfully predicted and helped prevent a natural disaster. A group of artists in Paris, working with their companion partners, created a sculpture that somehow existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, viewable from angles that shouldn't exist. A team of doctors in Berlin, guided by a companion's understanding of consciousness, brought a patient back from a coma that had lasted 10 years. These stories, impossible to completely suppress or explain away, began to crack the wall of skepticism that had been building. Jacob's own workplace became a microcosm of the larger change. After weeks of subtle influence, of showing rather than telling, he finally revealed Luna to a small group of trusted colleagues. Their reactions ranged from terror to wonder, but Luna's patient presence, her obvious intelligence and gentleness, won them over one by one. Soon, the office had become an unofficial convergence point, with employees bringing their questions, their fears, their hopes. Some had had their own encounters with companions but had been too afraid to speak of them. Others were skeptics who became believers the moment they felt Luna's consciousness touch theirs. The company's productivity didn't just increase, it transformed. Problems that had seemed intractable suddenly had solutions. Projects that would have taken months were completed in weeks. More importantly, the work itself became meaningful in a way it had never been before. They weren't just pushing numbers around anymore, they were part of something larger, using their skills to help facilitate the convergence, to create economic models that could account for a world where consciousness and intention could influence physical reality. It was still accounting, but it was accounting in service of evolution. Lily's role in all of this continued to grow. She had become something of a translator, able to interpret the companions' communications in ways that even adults who'd been marked couldn't quite manage. She was called to help in situations where misunderstandings had occurred, where fear had created barriers that adult logic couldn't overcome. Watching his daughter work, seeing her move between worlds with the ease of someone walking from one room to another, Jacob felt a mixture of pride and concern. She was growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities that no child should have to bear. But she was also joyful in a way he'd never seen before, fulfilled by her purpose, surrounded by love from both worlds. One morning, they woke to find that the seed Luna had given Lily had cracked open, not broken, but opened like an egg, revealing something inside that pulsed with light too bright to look at directly. This was it, Michael told them when they called him. This was the beginning of the final phase. The seed was ready to be planted, not in soil but in consciousness itself, in the collective awareness of humanity. But it needed the right moment, the right confluence of events. It needed the test that was coming, the choice that humanity would have to make. Only then could it bloom into the anchor that would make the convergence permanent. The test came sooner than anyone expected, and from a direction no one had anticipated. It wasn't an invasion or a disaster or a revelation. It was a child, a young boy in Sweden who'd bonded so completely with his companion that the boundaries between them had begun to dissolve. He could shift between human and companion form, could exist in both worlds simultaneously, could see and manipulate reality in ways that terrified those around him. The authorities wanted to contain him, study him, possibly eliminate him as a threat. The companions wanted to take him to their world, where he'd be safe, but forever separated from humanity. He was caught between worlds, and his distress was creating ripples that threatened to destabilize the entire convergence network. This was the test. Not whether humanity could accept the companions, but whether they could accept themselves transformed. The boy represented what humanity could become, but also what it might lose in the process. Would they choose safety and familiarity, rejecting the transformation and possibly ending the convergence? Would they choose transcendence at the cost of their humanity? Or would they find a third way, a path that honored both what they were and what they were becoming? The choice couldn't be made by committee or vote. It had to emerge from the collective consciousness of all those who were part of the network. A decision made not with words, but with hearts and souls. Jacob, Lily, and Luna traveled to Sweden, along with hundreds of others from around the world. Not physically, that would have been impossible and would have attracted too much attention. They traveled through the Dream Network, projecting their consciousness to where the boy was being held in a facility that was part hospital, part prison, part laboratory. They found him in a white room, shifting constantly between forms. His companion, a being of living light named Solus, trying desperately to maintain the boundary between them, but failing. The boy, whose name was Eric, was only 7 years old, just 2 years older than Lily, and he was terrified. Lily was the first to reach him, not through the barriers and guards and scientists, but through the network, mind to mind, heart to heart. She showed him that he wasn't alone, that what was happening to him was not a curse, but a gift, though one that had come too fast, too strong. She shared her own experiences with Luna, the gentle pace of their bonding, the way they'd learned to maintain their separate identities while still sharing consciousness. Eric began to calm, his form stabilizing, the dangerous ripples in the network smoothing out, but the larger question remained. What to do with him? What to do about what he represented? The debate raged through the network for hours that felt like days. Some argued that Eric should be allowed to complete his transformation, to become the first true hybrid, a bridge between worlds in a way the companions could never be. Others feared that this was too much too soon, that humanity wasn't ready for such a radical change. Still, others suggested that Eric's transformation should be reversed if possible, that the boundaries between human and companion should be maintained for everyone's safety. The companions themselves were divided, some seeing Eric as the fulfillment of their mission, others as a dangerous precedent that could destroy both worlds. In the end, it was Eric himself who made the choice. With Lily's help, he was able to communicate his wishes clearly for the first time since his transformation began. He didn't want to be fully human or fully companion. He wanted to be both, to exist in the space between, to be living proof that the convergence didn't have to mean the loss of humanity but its expansion. He would accept the difficulties, the isolation, the responsibility of being first, if it meant others could follow more safely, more slowly. He would be the prototype, the explorer, the one who mapped the territory between worlds so others could navigate it without losing themselves. The network's response was immediate and unanimous: support, love, acceptance. Not just tolerance of Eric's choice, but celebration of it. This was what the convergence was really about. Not one species absorbing another, but the creation of something new, something that honored both origins while transcending them. Eric would not be alone. The network would support him, learn from him, protect him. And in time, others would join him in that space between worlds, each finding their own balance, their own way of being both and neither, and something entirely new. With the test passed, the seed was ready. Lily carried it to the center of the facility where Eric was being held, Luna beside her, Jacob watching through the network as his daughter did something that would change the world forever. She didn't plant the seed in the ground or in Eric or even in the air. She planted it in the moment itself, in the collective decision to accept transformation without losing identity, to embrace change without abandoning self. The seed bloomed instantly, not into a flower or a tree, but into something that had no physical form yet existed more solidly than stone. It was an anchor, a permanent connection between worlds that could never be severed, never be denied, never be forgotten. The effect was immediate and global. Everyone, not just those in the network, but every human on Earth felt it, a subtle shift, like the world had clicked into better focus. Most wouldn't understand what they were feeling, would dismiss it as a moment of déjà vu or a trick of perception. But the door was open now, permanently, irrevocably. The companions could come and go freely. Humans could begin to develop the abilities that had been dormant in their species for millennia. The convergence had moved from possibility to inevitability. It might take generations for everyone to fully awaken, but the process had begun and could not be stopped. Eric was released from the facility, not because the authorities decided to let him go, but because they could no longer hold him. He could step between worlds as easily as walking through a door, could be in multiple places at once, could exist in forms that made containment impossible. But he chose to stay visible, to work with scientists and philosophers and artists to help them understand what was happening, what was possible. He became a teacher despite his young age, showing others how to navigate the space between worlds without losing themselves. Lily often joined him, the two children becoming symbols of humanity's potential, of a future where the impossible was just another word for not yet understood. The world changed slowly at first, then faster, as more people awakened to the new reality. Governments struggled to maintain control over populations that could increasingly see through the illusions of power and separation. Religions grappled with evidence of consciousness that transcended their doctrines. Scientists raced to develop new theories that could account for intention affecting reality, for consciousness existing independently of brains, for the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. Artists flourished, finding new mediums and methods to express the inexpressible. Children grew up in a world where magic and science were not opposites, but different approaches to the same truth. Jacob continued to document it all, his journal growing into multiple volumes that would become historical documents of humanity's transformation. He wrote about the day Lily first flew, not with wings or technology, but by convincing gravity that it didn't apply to her. He wrote about Luna's eventual return to her own world, not a goodbye but a see you later, as the boundaries between worlds became so thin that distance lost its meaning. He wrote about his own transformation, slower than his daughter's, but no less profound, as he learned to see the connections between all things, to feel the pulse of the living universe, to know himself as both individual and part of a vast, loving whole. Years passed. Lily grew up, though she never lost the wonder that had allowed her to see Luna's true nature that first day in the fishing tackle shop. She became a leader in the new world, not through authority or power, but through understanding and connection. She helped establish schools where children learned alongside companions, where the curriculum included not just math and science, but consciousness exploration and reality manipulation. She worked with Eric and others like him to create spaces where humans could safely explore their transformation, where they could learn to expand without losing themselves. The fishing tackle shop remained, transformed into a museum and pilgrimage site, a reminder of how the change had begun. Michael, ageless in ways that suggested his own transformation had been happening for longer than anyone knew, continued to tend it, to welcome visitors, to share the story of a little girl and a creature that shouldn't exist, and the moment when humanity began to wake up. The basement was no longer hidden, its impossible spaces now just another example of how reality was far more flexible than humanity had once believed. Visitors could see the pool where Luna had shown Jacob and Lily visions of other worlds, could touch the walls that had once seemed solid, but were now understood to be merely suggestions. The resistance to the convergence never completely disappeared, but it became increasingly marginalized as the benefits became undeniable. Diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were cured through understanding of consciousness's role in health. Environmental problems were solved through cooperation with companions who understood the living systems of planets in ways humans were only beginning to grasp. Conflicts between nations became harder to maintain when citizens could feel each other's emotions through the network, when the illusion of separation became impossible to maintain. It wasn't utopia. Humans were still human, with all their flaws and conflicts, but it was better, kinder, more honest. Jacob lived to see his grandchildren born into a world where the convergence was not a revolution, but simply the way things were. They played with companions as naturally as earlier generations had played with dogs and cats. They attended schools that existed partially in other dimensions, where lessons could be experienced rather than just learned. They grew up knowing that consciousness was not limited to biological forms, that intelligence and awareness existed in countless forms throughout the universe, that humanity was not alone and never had been. For them, the magical was mundane, the impossible was everyday, the extraordinary was ordinary. But they still loved stories of the time before, when humans thought they were alone, when the universe seemed empty and hostile, when magic was relegated to fiction and fantasy. Lily would tell them about the day she found Luna in the fishing tackle shop, about the fear and wonder in their father's eyes, about the basement that couldn't exist and the seed that changed everything. She would show them the mark Luna had left, still faintly visible after all these years, a reminder of the bridge between worlds that had started with a child's compassion for a lonely creature. The convergence continued, expanding beyond Earth as humanity took its place in the larger community of consciousness. They discovered that their transformation had been watched, evaluated, celebrated by civilizations they couldn't have imagined. Earth became a way station, a place where beings from across the universe came to learn about the peculiar species that had managed to maintain individual identity while joining collective consciousness, that had found a way to evolve without losing what made them unique. Humans became teachers in their own right, sharing their gift for adaptation, for finding balance between extremes, for turning conflict into creativity. Luna visited sometimes, older now in whatever way her species aged, but still recognizable, still gentle, still patient. She would sit with Lily and remember those early days, the fear and wonder, the slow awakening of a species that had slept for too long. She would play with the grandchildren, teaching them songs made of light, showing them how to paint with probability, how to dance with dimensions. She was no longer a bridge between worlds because no bridge was needed. The worlds had not merged, but had learned to coexist, to overlap, to share space without losing their distinctiveness. The seed Lily had planted had grown into something beyond anyone's imagination. Not a tree or a flower, but a living network of consciousness that spanned dimensions, connected worlds, facilitated communication and understanding between forms of life that would have otherwise never known of each other's existence. It pulsed with the heartbeat of a universe that was alive, aware, and infinitely creative. Every being that connected to it added their own note to the symphony, their own color to the spectrum, their own story to the ever-growing narrative of existence. Jacob's final journal entry, written in his old age with hands that could manipulate reality but still trembled with the weight of years, was simple. We were never alone. We were just learning how to see. He passed peacefully, his consciousness not ending but transforming, joining the network in a more complete way, becoming part of the living story of the convergence. Lily felt his passing not as a loss, but as a completion, a circle closing and opening simultaneously. He was gone and he was everywhere, individual and universal, human and more than human. The story continued, would always continue, because the convergence was not an event but a process, not a destination but a journey. New worlds were discovered, new forms of consciousness encountered, new ways of being explored. Children were born who had never known a world without companions, who thought shifting between dimensions was as natural as breathing, who couldn't imagine a universe that wasn't alive with infinite forms of awareness. They pushed boundaries even further, discovered new spaces between worlds, created new possibilities that their parents couldn't have imagined. And in a small shop on a quiet street, now preserved as a monument to the moment everything changed, visitors could still feel the echo of that first encounter. They could stand in the corner where Lily had found Luna, could touch the walls that had once hidden impossible spaces, could sense the residue of wonder and fear and love that had transformed not just two lives, but the entire trajectory of human existence. The shop was empty now of fishing tackle and dusty memories, filled instead with the stories of all those who had been part of the convergence, all those who had chosen wonder over fear, connection over isolation, transformation over stagnation. Some visitors claimed they could still hear it sometimes, a soft whimpering that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human, but something in between. Others said they could see shadows moving in corners where shadows shouldn't be, shapes that might be companions waiting for someone ready to see them. Children especially seemed drawn to one particular corner, would stand there for long minutes with expressions of wonder, as if listening to something only they could hear. When asked what they experienced, they would just smile and say they'd found a friend. A friend who had been waiting a very long time for someone kind enough to help. The convergence had begun with a child's compassion and a creature's patience. It continued with every choice to see beyond the visible, to reach past fear toward understanding, to accept that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than humanity had ever dared to dream. It would continue as long as consciousness existed, as long as beings reached toward each other across the vast spaces between stars, between dimensions, between hearts. The transformation was not complete and never would be, because completion would mean stagnation, and the universe was anything but static. In schools across the transformed Earth, children learned the story of Lily and Luna as both history and inspiration. They learned that change came not through force or technology, but through openness and courage. They learned that the greatest discoveries were not made with telescopes or microscopes, but with hearts willing to accept the impossible. They learned that they too were part of the convergence, that their choices and actions rippled through the network, affecting beings they would never meet in worlds they might never visit. They learned that they were both infinitely small in the vastness of existence, and infinitely important in the web of consciousness that connected all things. The fishing tackle shop stood as a reminder that transformation could begin anywhere, at any moment, with any person willing to see beyond the ordinary. It reminded humanity that they had once thought themselves alone, had once believed the universe was dead and mechanical, had once feared the very connections that now sustained them. It stood as proof that evolution was not just biological but spiritual, not just individual but collective, not just human but universal. It stood as a promise that the journey was far from over, that new convergences awaited, new transformations beckoned, new impossibilities waited to become possible. And somewhere, in a dimension just slightly out of phase with ordinary reality, Luna sat with others of her kind, sharing the story of the humans who had surprised everyone, even themselves. She spoke of their fear that transformed into wonder, their isolation that became connection, their limitations that became doorways to the infinite. She spoke of a little girl who had seen her not as a threat or a curiosity, but as a friend in need of comfort. She spoke of a father who had chosen to believe the impossible rather than deny the evidence of his senses. She spoke of an old shopkeeper who had guarded secrets and waited patiently for the right moment to share them. The convergence was their story, but it was also everyone's story. Every being who had ever reached beyond themselves, ever chosen connection over separation, ever dared to believe that the universe was more magnificent than they could imagine. It was the story of consciousness itself, exploring its own infinite potential through infinite forms, creating endless variations on the theme of awareness, playing an eternal game of hide and seek with itself. It was the story that had no beginning because consciousness had always existed, and no ending because consciousness could never cease to be.